So, hi everybody. I'm so grateful that you're here with us. My name is Jennifer Drake-Croft. I am the Director of Early Childhood Wellbeing here with the Tennessee Commission on Children and Youth. And I am so excited that we have one of our colleagues and a fellow Building Strong Brains trainer, and her name is Dr. Mona Ivey-Soto. She has a wealth of experience, and I'm going to let her do a brief introduction, but she is a great partner of ours who is a professor, an associate professor at Belmont University. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share her presentation with you all and let her begin.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. I'm so pleased to join you via WebEx this afternoon and talk about some really critical research that I and others have been thinking very deeply about in terms of our work with adverse childhood experiences and thinking about how we really look at this work from a holistic manner and address issues of racial justice. So before you should see the presentation entitled Racing ACEs, Examining the Relationship Between Adverse Childhood Experiences, ACEs, and Racism. And as my dear friend Jen Drake-Croft said, my name is Mona. I'm a professor in the Education Department at Belmont University in Nashville, Tennessee, and have the privilege of training future teachers to really think a lot about these issues of adversity and social emotional development and other things that they will be facing in classrooms around the country, and help them to be prepared for teaching the whole child and responding to the needs of families and communities as well. And so it's an honor to be a part of this work and ACEs that's happening in a really robust way across the state of Tennessee. And it's exciting to join all of you in this continued learning. So I welcome us to start with these shared agreements, and these are some things not necessarily for our time together today, but also for you as you take information and present to constituents in your community. I think it's always helpful to kind of lay a framework and groundwork as we think about engaging in really important discussions, and especially as we think about this topic of speaking to and naming institutional and structural racism. We want to think about how to open the space and create dialogue to have those important conversations. So when you find yourself out in the community training individuals and incorporating this information perhaps into your ACEs training or into your conversations about ACEs, I want you to think about these shared agreements. So coming to this work with 100% of ourselves, thinking about the importance of not allowing other distractions of technology to invade our thinking and our time, just really giving our energy and our full participation and engagement with these issues. When we present to groups, really thinking about how we presume welcome and extend welcome. So we're assuming best intentions about our audience and asking that they do the same thing for us as we are sharing with them. Understanding that there's freedom in our sharing, we extend compassion in the stories that we share and highlight. We always say it's an invitation, not an invasion. So especially when we open up the floor for perhaps more complex conversations about social justice or about other social issues, we want people to feel invited into the circle and into the conversation, rather than feeling as if they are forced to participate or forced to engage. We hope that when we create these guidelines, it will just make people really interested to be a part of these important conversations. Listening with what researchers call soft eyes or compassion. We can all think about times when we've shared information with somebody that maybe has been information that maybe was hard to share, and the importance of how we relate and how relational we are in our body language when we share that information. So listening with soft eyes creates an open stance in our posture and in our body language to demonstrate that we are have a real interest in what somebody else is sharing with us and giving off that sense of empathy and compassion in delivering material ourselves. And then finally, when things get difficult, turn to wonder. So this is a really great rule, I think, just in life. When you are hearing difficult things or ideas that might fly in the face of our usual way of looking at issues. So, for example, with ACEs, maybe you haven't thought about the intersection of racism in society and how that affects adversity in children. Instead of, hearing new information and maybe saying, oh, I don't agree with that, or I don't see it that way, we turn to wonder, and we wonder what that might be like. We wonder when we hear different stories from participants who might be sharing that reality. We go from a posture of wanting to share to a posture of wanting to listen, from knowing to wondering. And so all of these shared agreements really help us to have what we would call a stance of humility in approaching this really important work. So I thank you for listening through those before we start in. On your next slide, you'll see a very important quote that I think frames this work and frames dialogue around critical conversations that as we said, that might be difficult to have in our country, in our communities. So this idea of we can't heal what we don't reveal, right? We can't begin as a nation, as a community, as professionals working with children and families to allow our systems and our individuals to experience wellness until we reveal the issues that have plagued our country and our community for years. And racism is one of those things. So we don't get better if we don't admit that we're sick, right? In a way, we can't always be in a stance to think that something like racism doesn't exist, but really acknowledging that it does, standing from a place of revealing the evidence of it, and then looking at the ways that we can address it individually and systemically. So the reason why I and others became really interested in really shining a light on racism was because many of the events that I had gone to in Tennessee and also across the country in relation to ACEs highlighted many important studies around racial differences, right? So you'd see, some of you might know those pie charts or those graphs that show different categories of racial groups, and show either the number of ACEs in relation to different racial groups, or maybe if it was just even information outside of ACEs, but just number of, let's say, what quote unquote risk factors. And my reflections after many of those meetings across the country was that I wondered if I was thinking about this, perhaps were others. Could you walk away from a meeting like that and just see a conversation around different racial groups and assume that it was simply our racial differences or people seeing our differences as deficiencies and say, oh, well, because these groups are of different racial categories, that is what inherently creates a greater likelihood of increased ACEs. And not that that was ever said, but calling out specifically racism was never also said in a way that helped me frame this conversation to look at how individual and structural racism had an impact on early childhood adversity. So I really felt this compelling need to show that, and myself and others, I'm not the only one, but many of us got together to say this is important, to really call out how our systems and structures in this country have been impacted by racism and how that is a contributing factor to the number of ACEs that we see that are prevalent in many communities of color. It's simply not enough to look at racial differences as an indicator of the difference in the number of ACEs, but to look at the impact of racism. This quote really highlights what I've just said. Race itself is only a risk factor to the extent that personal, institutional, or structural discrimination and racism block opportunities for traditional success. So we have to continuously ask ourselves how individual and structural manifestations of racism have contributed to higher incidences of ACEs. So addressing racism has to be at the core of our solution to mitigate ACEs. We cannot have a conversation that separates those things because for many of our communities of color, racism has been at the center of the risk and challenge that has impacted individuals and communities. And so in response to that, we have to address racism at the center. So as we think about our trainings, even our conversations about ACEs, and I know that this has become, as I said, Tennessee is really becoming a leader in how communities are responding to ACEs research. So we want to think about the importance of our conversations, individually, collectively, our trainings, any engagement that we have with other programs and agencies, thinking about how we frame these issues from both the perspective of being trauma-informed and racially just. So every time that we think about, or we've heard the term trauma-informed, we want to be a trauma-informed organization or a trauma-informed community or have a trauma-informed school, that we think about the way that racial justice has to be at the center of that. And that in order to, again, create that level of change, those two frameworks have to be integrated, and we'll talk more about what that looks like as we continue. For example, having a racial justice lens means that when we look at data and systems in ways that consider how racism has had an impact in shaping and maintaining it, but we don't just look at that information from the perspective of, as I said, racial differences, but looking at, what are the ways that racial injustice might have had a role in how these outcomes are showing in a particular study or in data that we might collect on our own community or across our state. For example, when we look at reading outcomes of our students, or we look at outcomes in juvenile justice, right? There are many factors that have contributed to what we would call those disparities between racial groups, but we can't simply just say that it's just disparities and differences amongst groups without acknowledging and really calling out racial injustice that is a part of those systems. On our next slide, we really will help also set the stage for thinking about the kind of language that we want to use as we talk about these issues. Having correct language, having language that is evidence-based is so important in the creation of our Building Strong Brains training. And this is just another part of that as we think about the kinds of words that we want to use and the kinds of language that we want to describe our work in addressing racial injustice in ACEs. So we hear the word diversity used pretty much everywhere. I don't think I can go a day without hearing it. And there's nothing wrong with the word diversity, but because it is being overused, I think that it's also being defined in many different ways and almost applying to a lot of things that may or may not fit that category. So as we think about, again, that idea of racial justice, we want to avoid, in a way, using the term diversity, because really diversity means variety. If we like to eat a diversity of foods, we like to try different foods. If we like a diversity of music, that means that we like a variety of music. That's not at the core of what we're talking about when we're talking about racial justice. The next set of lines below that tell us that in our work, we're also not striving for equality, and that might catch some people off. Well, it is equality that we want, right? Yes and no. Equality really by definition, and especially as we look at systems and as we look at supports for our children, equality means sameness. And we really don't want all of our children to have the same supports or all of our communities to have the same supports, right? Racial justice really is asking us to take that a step further and focus on equity, right? Which is giving children, communities, families, communities what they need, right? Giving them what they need based on what the presenting issues are, which is not going to be the same for everybody, right? But it's going to be what is fair, what is equitable, what is just. And especially for our communities, our families, and our children who have been impacted by racism, addressing that as a central focus in their healing and in their mitigation of their ACEs is critical. They may, students or children may present with the same number of ACEs, But if we have a child of color who has experienced racism, that's going to have to be a part of addressing that in a part of their process of wellness in a way that would be different than, a child in the dominant culture who has not experienced racism, certainly has experienced other ACEs, but part of addressing, programs or policies or procedures for well-being would have to look at racism for the child, the family, or the community that has been impacted by that. The next couple of slides will introduce you to a common picture that you may have seen floating around social media or used as examples in your workplace for kind of helping people understand the differences between equality and equity. And I hope to take it perhaps one step further than what you may have seen in some of those examples, and just as we highlight what it means for our work in mitigating ACEs. So each of the pictures has a fence, as you can see. Using the metaphor of the fence, we can see that some people have more difficulty seeing over the fence because of the social conditions and systemic inequities around them. In the first image, we can see that some people are standing on lower ground, right, which could be a metaphor for historical oppression. For example, consider things like slavery, Jim Crow, our treatment of Native Americans, Mexican Americans, and many other examples of historical oppression. So that if we're using this image as a metaphor, would cause that individual or that group to be starting on lower ground. As you can see, all of the individuals are trying to see over the fence. And in some ways, in some parts of the picture, there are higher parts of the fence, right? The fence is not even at an equal length for all of the individuals. So we can say that that's a metaphor for present day systems of oppression. In that first image, you can also see a hole in the fence, which was made for the person that's all the way on the right. And that can symbolize creative and often subversive ways that people find to work around systems and get what they need, right? We see that every day. Many of our families who are marginalized due to poverty or racism have very strong means of ingenuity to be able to address those barriers, and should be, we should look at them for their resilience to be able to do that. They think of many ways to be able to have better circumstances or outcomes, even when they're not afforded the opportunity from programs or agencies or other things. In the next graphic, the equity graphic, we can see that the conditions around the individuals really haven't changed. But the supports provided, which are different for each one, allow each person access and an ability to engage. So the fence, the size of the fence has not changed, i.e. the barrier. The levels of the ground have not changed, right, representing different forms of historical and current oppression. But the supports provided to the individuals have allowed each person to be able to, in this case, see the game or engage in whatever the activity that is before them. Each individual is not getting the same number of blocks, but really getting what they need. So all individuals need different things. As we said with equity, one person is getting 1 block, 1, 2, and 1, 3 blocks. So if you think about this in terms of our work with ACEs, how do our children and adults with higher ACEs access equitable services and supports that meet their individual needs? And thinking specifically about racism, how do our children of color with ACEs, what are the increased barriers that they face due to living in a racist society? And how can we look to equitable measures to address that? How can we as individuals across our state work to address ACEs and consider the additional layers that racism creates in addressing for personal and systemic healing? Finally, in our last slide, which I think is really what I would like to highlight, striving for equity and giving each person what they need is a very important part. But in this third image, which became kind of iterations of these images because they were used so much on social media other researchers began to say, equity is important, but what we really want is justice. And equity is a part of that, right? But what we really want to do is figure out how to dismantle the larger system, not just give the individuals, what they need to address the issue right there, right? But how can we really get at the core of the problem? So, for example, we might think about, addressing issues of hunger through food stamps and food banks. That's an incredible solution and a really important part of the issue. However, the deeper issue of hunger and how pervasive it is in our country, we also want to be looking at that. We want to be looking at, why is there such a disproportionate spread of income to where we have so many people that are still hungry, for example. So we're kind of doing both things at the same time. We're still addressing the immediate need of getting people, let's say, food or access to health care, but we're asking those bigger questions as individuals and as agencies of how do we address the bigger issue, which is why are there so many people who are hungry? Why are there so many people who lack access to supports and services? So we're sort of working on an individual and a systems level. And this graphic of justice is looking at addressing those systemic barriers. How do we literally tear down the walls to make whatever individuals want to seek or whatever they're looking to engage in, whether that's whatever's on the other side of that wall is education or high quality early care. How do we tear down the walls to make that accessible to all of our children and not just those who are able to gain the resources to be able to access those things without any issues? So as we said, an important part of this process is thinking about our language and making sure that we have the correct language to talk about these kinds of issues. And just as I said, the term diversity, I believe, is used and in many ways perhaps overused or overshared. I believe that many of us, and this is beyond just the spread of this phone call, but across the country, as I've done this work, I've had many people come up to me after trainings and say, I've never heard racism described that way. And I can't take credit for it. I didn't define it, but I feel like a lot of times we hear the word racism, prejudice, bias used all in the same way. And so what that does is when we hear, many words given the same definition, in some ways it dilutes the power of that word. It also perhaps provides confusion as to who is quote unquote responsible. And so I think it's important for us to think about what is racism? How is it different from other forms of oppression? And we don't have time in this webinar to go through all of the different forms of oppression, but we want to focus specifically on racism because of its connection with ACEs. So I don't want you to think I'm ignoring other things, but we're trying to just focus in on this as an issue as it relates to ACEs. So again, I've said many times we hear bias, prejudice, and racism used interchangeably. And I want you to just note, if you don't already, and many of you may already know this, that those are different concepts. As we're talking about mitigating ACEs and as we're talking about addressing systemic injustice that is historical and current, we are talking about racism, and we're talking about prejudice plus power. So prejudice and bias are its own category, different from racism, because those categories lack what we call institutional power. But racism takes prejudice, which is, prejudging someone based on, limited information, stereotypes, omissions. But with racism, we're adding power. We're adding institutional and we're adding individual power. And so, or we could also say it's a system of advantage based on race. And so as we think about racism, we certainly can think about individual acts of racism that occur, and we've, unfortunately seen a lot of that happening in communities across the country where, someone is called a racist term, or someone is, physically assaulted in a racist manner. those are things that we want to certainly address, and they have a direct impact on adversity. In addition to those individual acts, what we really want to think about are our systems, the ways that the institutions in our country operate to statistically benefit white individuals in our country and systematically marginalize individuals of color. Also to note, because I know some people will say, well, that's not always the case. It's not always the case, but we're talking about we're talking about, what our data indicates as, statistically significant accounts. So we're talking about our education system, our healthcare system, our housing system, our criminal justice system, our employment system, and others as well, that systematically benefit white individuals in this country and systematically disadvantage individuals of color, and in particular African Americans, due to the history and legacy of slavery and Jim Crow in our country. As we said, there are individual examples that would perhaps challenge that notion that I just said, but we're talking about clear pictures of data that give us that evidence. And in a few minutes, we'll watch a video that will also kind of hone in to help you understand when we talk about racism being a system of advantage, what that looks like. That also means that to understand racism as prejudice plus power, we have to understand that those who are responsible for perpetuating racism in our country are people with power. And in our country, that is white individuals. That doesn't mean that people of color can't hold prejudices or biases. But as I said previously, that's different. Those are acts, and we certainly know that those acts need to be addressed. But what we say is that individuals of color don't systematically benefit from having prejudice beliefs. They don't gain access to greater income or greater power in our country by having prejudice beliefs. Those prejudice beliefs are wrong and need to be changed. But when we're talking about racism, we're talking about a system of advantage and who benefits from those systems. So bear with me. I know that's a lot to take in, but hopefully that information will help you think about language and the language we've used or the language that we're going to use to describe these issues. So we're going to watch a video now that I think will help you understand what we talk about when we say systemic racism or the systems that perpetuate racism in our country. hopefully they'll be able to read it. We're sorry that you weren't able to hear the sound on the video. We will email it to you. The sound was just background music, really. I think you were able to hopefully see all of the studies, all of the words that were there on that screen, just to really highlight, as I said, all of those systems that are operating. And this is on a daily basis. So you think about all of those, and those are just really the tip of the iceberg of all of the examples that we saw. Housing, we saw somebody who is trying to access a new car or purchasing power. We think about sort of that consumer area, healthcare, political issues, employment, and again, as I said, criminal justice as well, countless examples. I know personally, I'll share a personal story for myself and my husband. We were notified that our bank for our car loan, I believe, had overcharged us as individuals of color. And so we both received a refund check, which was nice, but this was 6 months ago. So when we look at those predatory lending practices or unfair and discriminatory acts in businesses, this was something that we encountered just 6 months ago, that individuals basically with, I'm not sure, if it was based on the demographic data that we filled out when we were applying for a loan or whatever it was, but individuals of color were impacted by this. And so this is very current. And if you think about, for many individuals of color in this country, these kinds of situations and incidences that are happening daily, and the amount of what we call race-based stress and how that contributes to our stress systems, how that contributes to adversity. The video didn't even get into examples really in K-12 education, but that's a whole other arena if we think of the stressors and the kinds of situations that we know that are happening in our public education system for children of color. There are thousands of studies around that as well. So I encourage you, think about what industry you represent, as well as what organizations and systems you interface with, and how racial injustice has plagued those systems historically and currently. All of the research, all of those things that we just saw in that video were not anything from 50 years ago, but things that are happening daily now. So I hope that that video was able to give you a visual of what we've been talking about in terms of systemic racism. So just to continue to build on our conversations around racism, looking at interpersonal racism, and perhaps maybe I should have put this first, because this is often what individuals think about when they think to say, I am not racist, which most people would say. They think about that level of interpersonal racism. So, acts of racism from an individual in power to a person of color. So thinking about words that we say, behaviors and beliefs. And that's an important thing to note, as I've said before, that there's an increase in these individual or interpersonal acts of racism. However, if you yourself may say, I don't harbor these things, it's important to still recognize that as a person with institutional power, you benefit from racism in this country. So even if you don't see yourself as contributing to racism through these interpersonal acts, you are still a part of that system from the benefits that you gain if you are in the dominant group. I would also challenge all of us to think about, again, sort of, even if it's not through those presenting words or behaviors, but the beliefs that we harbor. What are the ways that we've allowed beliefs about groups that are different from us, groups of color in our own community or beyond, to influence our thinking about, their educational well-being or their health or other things, that our beliefs, which are built on living in a society that is racist, how does that impact our ability to deliver services or programs within our community? So just another definition to highlight what we've been talking about of structural or systemic racism. So it refers to a system of disadvantage placed on one group by another group, and it's supported by government institution, laws, and policies. And we saw that very clearly in the video. There are many ways that these systems are upheld, many times because we don't even realize that these injustices are taking place. And hopefully from this webinar and other learning experiences, and perhaps for some of you personal experiences that you've encountered, you will now begin to put on a different lens, right? I call it that racial lens. We put on our racial lens to begin to see things now. As we've seen, we begin to question data. We begin to look at outcomes perhaps in a different way and begin to see, how racism has impacted this. And because of that, what do we need to do to make changes? As leaders in this work around adverse childhood experiences, we've mentioned historical racial trauma. It's important that we understand how historical trauma in communities of color have an impact and still present themselves in individuals and in communities, and that we name that. Again, we talked about the history surrounding, our country's racial history. If you have not seen the documentary 13th by Ava DuVernay, I highly recommend that you do. I think that sets the stage for understanding how our nation has contributed to, all of these issues that are presenting now. If we think about the metaphor of a tree, right? There's the roots of the tree which go very deep. We don't see all of those roots, we just see what's on the surface. But yet we have to fully understand all of the things that have come before whatever our presenting issues are, whatever is before us on the surface. Just as the tree would not be what it is without its roots. Looking at the conditions and issues that plague our communities, and in particular communities of color, they didn't just happen overnight. They didn't just arrive. Poverty didn't just come, or segregation in housing, or quote unquote good schools, bad schools, which I would ask that we don't even use that language. But all of those issues that we see before us didn't just happen. They have historical roots that are very deep and that are very much tied to the racial and racist past of our country. Just to give you a more formal definition of the term that we used, racial trauma or race-based traumatic stress. So we think back to, what some of the examples we saw in the video, and in countless studies looking at the daily stressors, that the impact of that stressful event or encounter, the emotional pain of one's experience with racism and discrimination, and how that has a direct impact on health. How that has a direct impact on one's well-being, so from a social emotional perspective in society as a result of encountering those daily incidences of racism and racial stress. We also think about the traumatic events that occur as a result of witnessing or experiencing racism and discrimination. Perhaps for some of our children, it might be something that they witness or encounter their parents experiencing in public. And so also thinking about, if we're not necessarily just the individuals who are encountering it or experiencing it, but also those who are witnessing those situations, how it has a profound impact on their well-being and on their, from an emotional perspective as well as a physical perspective, health-wise. Our strategies for addressing racial trauma have centered on affirming and validating individuals experiencing traumatic stress, and that is an important part. We do want to always look at how we in our professions and in our personal lives can support individuals who have experienced racial trauma. So part of that is allowing them to share their story and validating that story. Again, if we think back to those early guidelines we went over, turning to wonder. So when somebody, for example, shares an encounter that they had that was racist, instead of saying, oh, I'm sure the other person didn't mean that, validating their story, hearing it through, asking more questions to try to understand their perspective. And really honoring that their perspective is their reality and that's their truth. And it's if we're in a position to be able to, listen through that and provide them support, that's really an important thing. So just as we support that individual and what they're encountering, we also want to shine a light and look at how can we change systems and structures. So if an individual talks about, a negative encounter that they had at a public school or at a healthcare provider, and, we want to certainly, talk to them through that hard situation, hear what was their concern, but also think about what is that larger system. So if I'm a person with some institutional power, how can I now go and have a conversation in my public school or in my in the healthcare community or in an employment office or within the criminal justice system to shine a light on those deeper systemic inequities, those systems that have allowed these conditions to exist that have impacted individuals. So we're addressing both the individual and what's happened to them as a result of racism, but also looking at that deeper systemic problem at the same time, because we cannot just continue to, quote unquote, put Band-Aids on something. We have to look at the deeper cause. We use the analogy of, children who, are drinking from a well and it's making them sick. We can give them all the medication we want to treat their illness, but what we really need to do is go to the well and realize that it's the source. There's something at the source that is making them unwell. So we have to, in the same way, go to the source of the problem, which is the system or the structure that is perpetuating racial injustice, and address that. ACE's research can contribute to greater understanding of the multiple challenges to be addressed to improve population health. Many of the solutions, and particularly the ones related to racial and ethnic disparities, must examine the harm of racism and repairing that harm through dismantling systems and structures that were perpetuated. So we're looking at, just in that picture of the fence, tearing down the fence and rebuilding, right? Looking at how we can rebuild our agencies, our programs, our institutions to be more racially just, to provide equitable services and resources and procedures and policies for all individuals, and not just those who are part of the dominant culture.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you so much, Dr. Ivey-Soto, for developing this and presenting it so articulately, or whatever the word is. Yeah, we're really grateful for that. And just so you all know, the reason we started our webinar series with this presentation is because we have revamped our presentation, our Building Strong Brains presentation, to be more inclusive of this information and strong data, and help us do a better job of creating wellness and strong brain architecture and building resilience for all children in our state. So with that being said, we have about 10 minutes to answer any questions, but we would ask that, given the volume of people that are currently on this webinar, that you use the chat box. So if anybody would like to use the chat box to ask any questions, Dr. Ivey-Soto can see those and answer them to help you out. Before we start answering those questions, I want to remind you all that we will have another interactive webinar next week. It's on the 23rd, I believe. And I have sent everybody an invite for that. So everybody who is a Building Strong Brains trainer, we will be walking through the new slide deck content, and I'll be answering any questions. And I will be recommending that any of our trainers watch a recording of this presentation if they weren't here live before they participate in that interactive presentation. Just like our frameworks presentation, it's a foundation of knowledge that we want all of our trainers to be empowered with before they start presenting the new slides and the new content. So let's get started. Do we have any questions that folks would like to put in the chat box for Dr. Ivey-Soto? Okay, not seeing any. Maybe people, oh, here we go.
How can employees support one another facing institutionalized racism when the workplace or organizations do not? A really, really good question. So I think thinking back to our presentation, we do want to value individual stories. So sometimes I know organizations have, if the policies and procedures of the larger organization don't allow for, let's say, follow-up to address racism or racial injustice, thinking about how employees can leverage those human relationships. So maybe, forming a support group within an organization, or just knowing that there are what we call brave spaces to come together and have these conversations. I think that when those things happen, sometimes, those in quote unquote in charge of organizations will take note. They'll begin to see how, the individuals are coming together to empower and support one another. And hopefully that's happening across racial differences, right? So if we can look at how individuals in the dominant culture can come alongside, let's say somebody who's shared an instance of racism or racial injustice personally or in the workplace, and be really good listeners, and maybe leverage some of their, personal and institutional power to say, hey, this is happening in our workplace, and see if they can let those in charge or who have more power understand that reality. But if that's not happening at more of the sort of systemic level, I think forming those internal groups to be able to have those brave spaces to talk about these things is really important.
Our team felt that that element missing in our presentation. We felt like we were not doing enough to ensure that our greater community, that our greater state understood how the disproportionality of toxic stress among children of color, and exactly what kinds of policy solutions and system solutions need to take place in order to lessen the experiences of toxic stress and promote the opportunities to build resilience. So we absolutely are incorporating much of this content in a very well-framed way. We've worked with frameworks to develop a lot of it, and Dr. Ivey-Soto. And so we have it in several parts through our new presentation. And next week, we'll be revealing what new slides have been added and the facilitator's content that has been added. So it looks like our next question, Dr. Ivey-Soto, we're getting time, which is great. Any that we're unable to answer before 2 o'clock, we'll strive to answer via email. So the next question says, is there a resource that you can recommend that shows the disparity of health and mental health issues between whites and people of color that can be traced back to racial issues, economic stress, resource stress, and other inequities? So what do you say?
There's quite a few, and one thing maybe for the future to think about is putting together a bunch of these studies. Just off the top of my head, in terms of thinking about health issues, I'd encourage you all to watch the TED Talk by Dr. David Williams, and it's called, I think it's Is Racism Killing You? Or that sounds really harsh, but he is a physician, and he talks about how racism manifests itself through the healthcare system in ways that lead to more disproportionate health impacts on African Americans in particular, but people of color in general, from either African Americans not being told of information, routine medical information, to we know that Black women, regardless of social class, have a greater likelihood of death in childbirth. So even controlling for social class, not just low socioeconomic Black women, but even Black women with access to, financial resources, face huge disparities when it comes to childbirth, and so there are a lot of things. I can't think of like websites right now off the top of my head or articles, but I think that's something that we could probably put together and have a list that's sent out that could address that more specifically.
Yeah, when we send out all of what we're seeing, this recorded webinar, when we send that out, we will also send a few resources out that can further understanding or further even just access to data that really supports a lot of what Dr. Ivey-Soto has talked about today. So we've got about 7 more minutes to answer questions, and we've got one from Treva Maitland here. So here we go.
I'm working with the Public Defender's Office in the 20th Judicial District and find that most of our clients seem to have high ACEs scores. I think I see the school to prison pipeline in action, in fact. Even sadder, I think I see racial issues therein as well. My question is, what are we doing as a state to create programs to teach children resilience before they end up in the Public Defender's Office? Want to say anything about that?
Sure. Great question. Honestly, I feel like a lot of the work that we are doing here at, in the state of Tennessee with Building Strong Brains is exactly trying to do that. So I would say that it's less to do with teaching the students. I mean, some of it is about teaching students skills. Some of it is about social and emotional learning and those kinds of things. But a lot more of it has to do with systems and access. So really it's the adult's role, not the child's role necessarily, to build resilience, because children are a product of the environment and the opportunities that they have. And so we have many systems, as Dr. Ivey-Soto has illustrated through her presentation, that tap children's opportunities to build resilience, to build strong brain architecture, to build and create health. And so oftentimes what we are seeing in a public defender's office is a failure from various systems to give children opportunities to not just survive, but to thrive. And so that's exactly what we're trying to do with Building Strong Brains Tennessee, is to think about how we ensure that every child has the opportunity to develop well.
And I think, adding on to that, and as Jen said, looking at kind of the systems and the adults who are a part of those systems. So I know for me, one of the things I take very seriously in teacher education is making sure that I am helping to cultivate, teachers and teacher leaders and maybe future administrators coming out of our program to understand racial justice wherever they work. Not just, I need this because I'm going to work in an urban community with lots of, children of color, but wherever you are. And so understanding, again, putting on that racial lens of understanding, from a teacher's perspective, being able to look at their discipline policies, the way that they organize seating, the way that they build curriculum, the way that they, everything. How is it done from a perspective of racial equity? Somebody just posted something, I don't know if any of you all saw this on Facebook, of a workbook page from a child's workbook. I think it must maybe like a pre-K. I think they were tracing some letters, and there was 4 pictures of sketches of children's faces, and then you had to write down the emotion. And of those 4 pictures, the 2 quote unquote negative emotions were associated with Black children. Now, some people might look at that page and say, that was just a coincidence. They didn't mean that. But that's the way that racial bias seeps into the minds of children and educators in ways we don't even realize it, right? And so we can't expect children to build resilience if we're not, as the adults in their life, looking at the atmosphere, the environment, and the social conditions around them to allow them to have the best outcomes. So I'm going to use that as a teachable moment in my class to say, if you were a teacher and you encountered something like this in your curriculum, what would you do? You could use it as a teachable moment, and that, to show your students that this is wrong, regardless of where you're teaching, that this example is wrong, and it further provides a deficit lens on children of color. And that is beginning to build resilience, because that child of color in that space who hears that, begins to say to themselves, oh, that educator noticed me. They saw me. They saw that I'm more than just these, negative words on a paper. And that will begin to cultivate resilience. So I think there's a lot of, and that's a very specific example in a classroom. There are many ways that adults in the lives of children, once they understand how racial injustice impacts their work, they can begin to have that reflective stance to work through that. And then I believe that will translate into building more resilient children.
Wonderful. So we're going to go ahead and wrap the presentation right now. Like I said, we will send this recording to everyone, just in case. There's a few folks that have said that they've had trouble hearing. So we'll make sure that you all can, in that recording, fast forward to maybe parts of the presentation where it was a little bit difficult to hear. Again, if you are a Building Strong Brains trainer, please join us next Wednesday, January 23rd from 1 to 2:30, where we have an interactive webinar to describe how a lot of this information is being infused into our Building Strong Brains curriculum and review the new slides. I want to thank you all again for taking this time, and especially thank Dr. Ivey-Soto for helping us as we think about how we advance this work across the state and improve conditions for all children. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Sorry.